The Haunted Tower, written by Ink in My Heart and on the Page, and read for you by Eleanor Elizabeth. Summary. Steve didn't want to admit it, but he was beginning to think that the tower was haunted. Steve did not want to admit it, but he was beginning to think that the tower was haunted. At first, it was little things, the pattering sound of footsteps in the hallway running past his door, childish giggling echoing through the halls that made the hair on Steve's arms raise, and the freshly baked cookies that he'd placed on the bench for the team to enjoy would suddenly disappear when his back was turned. He was relieved to learn that he wasn't the only one who had noticed these odd happenings. Bruce had noticed little things disappearing from the lab, a pair of safety goggles that he'd sworn he'd gotten out suddenly missing, items being moved when he swore he was the only one inside the lab, and curiously he found little Lego pieces scattered around the tower with no idea how they got there. When Thor came to visit, he found his hammer decorated with a little red cape made of felt and googly eyes stuck to the handle, though Thor found this delightful rather than suspicious, and wondered who had done such a funny prank. Clint and Natasha didn't believe the tower was haunted. That was until one day when they walked into the communal living space to find small, blood-red footsteps leading from the elevator towards the living room, where they just suddenly stopped before the couch. There were no markings on the couch. It was as if the person who had made them had simply just vanished. "Ghosts aren't real," Clint said one night over dinner. It didn't stop him from glancing over at where the now cleaned-up footprints had been. "I didn't think aliens were real either," Steve pointed out. "After everything we've seen, ghosts are not out of the realm of possibility," Bruce added. "I wonder if Tony is aware of the odd happenings." "This is Tony," Natasha said dryly. "No wonder he avoids coming down here," Clint grunted before shoveling food into his mouth. Since moving into the tower, the group had rarely seen Tony. While they knew he was busy working on SI projects, they were surprised at how often the man seemed to avoid them. Steve had begun to wonder if his original assumption of Tony was correct. He had thought that the team moving into the tower would bring them closer, but Tony was often too busy to join them. He made sure to come to any meetings, usually late, and hung out occasionally, but not as much as Steve would have liked. He thought Tony was better than his original assessment, but he was starting to think that the man had not changed at all. "We should ask him," Steve decided. "Tomorrow." The opportunity to talk to Tony came early in the morning. Natasha, Bruce, and Clint followed Steve up to the penthouse where he resided with Pepper. Jarvis had allowed them entry once Tony had confirmed it was okay, and they rode the elevator up in silence. When the elevator stopped and the door slid open, the five of them froze. A small figure stood completely still a few feet away from the elevator. A white sheet covered the small figure, the tips dragging along the floor and hiding anything underneath. If there was anything underneath. Large, oval-like eyes had been coloured in black marker, but that was the only defining feature. "Is everyone else seeing this?" Clint asked quietly. "Yes," Steve swallowed. "Hey guys, you planning on leaving the elevator at all?" Tony asked, appearing suddenly and giving them an amused smirk. Tony?" Bruce frowned, gesturing at the ghost. Tony looked down and then back to Bruce. "What, you never seen a ghost before?" "So the tower is haunted," Steve stated, unsure at how he felt at this new development. Tony's smirk grew more pronounced. He gently cupped the head of the ghost and tilted it towards him. "Hey, have you been haunting my tower?" The ghost shook his head. You sure about that?" Tony asked. The ghost nodded. "Well, these guys think you're haunting them, so how about you take your costume off?" Tony chuckled softly. The ghost hurried to peel the sheet off their body, and the group came face to face with a young boy. He had big brown eyes, curly hair that was sticking up from the sheet, and a worried look on his face. "Not ghost. Promise." "See? Not a ghost." Tony winked at the group, hand automatically soothing down the child's hair. "I can promise you the tower is not haunted." Steve stepped out of the lift, the others following him as he stared at the young kid. "Besides," Tony continued, "ghosts don't get any lunch, do they, Peter?" "Lunch!" Peter squealed, jumping up and down. "I want lunch!" "Come on then," Tony said, scooping up the child in a motion that was obviously familiar. "You guys can join if you're hungry." Steve followed automatically. His mind tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but he couldn't. Tony Stark was holding a child in his arms, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was not an image that Steve would have associated with the man, and it was one that was hard to wrap his head around. "All right, Underoos, what do you want?" Tony asked, stopping in the kitchen. "Juice pops!" Peter cheered, his legs kicking as he bounced in Tony's arms. "You eat any more juice pops and you're going to look like one," Tony teased. "And your mom will be mad if I turn you into a juice pop." Peter giggled, and Steve balked as he realised that it was the same giggling that he'd heard echoing down the halls. "Mac and cheese!" Peter decided instead. "Good choice." Tony grinned and he planted Peter on the bench. "You stay here, all right? You can be head chef. Now, no crawling around." Peter nodded seriously. "'Kay, Daddy." "You have a kid?" Steve finally managed to speak as Tony opened the fridge and pulled out a dish. Yeah?" Tony frowned, taking the cling film off the dish and started spooning out a portion of mac and cheese that had obviously been made the day before into a new pot. "More please, Daddy," Peter said, staring into the new pot. Tony added some more into the pot. "Tony, you have a child," Steve stressed, glancing between the two. Tony stared at Steve, eyes flicking over him in a way that Steve knew he was assessing the man. "Yeah, Steve. Peter is my child. I know." "You didn't tell us you had a kid," Steve said as Clint approached Peter and offered his hand for a high five, which Peter eagerly gave. "Yeah, I did," Tony retorted. "No, you didn't," Natasha said as she slid into a stool behind the kitchen bench. "I'm impressed you managed to keep him hidden so well." "Yeah," Clint added, giving Tony a look. "It's hard to keep a family secret." Tony frowned, putting the pot on the stove and lighting up a burner. "I must have forgotten to tell you guys. Well, guys, this is my son, Peter." "Hi!" Peter chimed in, giving a wave and a cute smile. "Nice to meet you, Peter." Steve smiled back. He felt as if he'd missed a step, stomach swooping as he tried to regain balance. The resemblance between Peter and Tony was uncanny. There was no doubt that this was Tony's son. "Daddy, I have to wash my hands now," Peter said, throwing his hands up in the air. "Yeah, you do," Tony agreed. He scooped Peter off the bench and carried him over to the sink. "Steve, do you mind stirring that mac and cheese?" Steve nodded, moving to the pot and doing as Tony asked. While he did, he watched Tony interacting with Peter out of the corner of his eye. Tony let Peter turn on the tap and squeeze his own soap, giving him encouraging words as he did. The whole routine brought a smile to Steve's face. Guilt churned in his stomach. Once again, he had misjudged Tony. He had made fast assumptions about the man that weren't true. Tony was the man to lay down on the wire, and everything he did was for his son. "Don't wipe your hands on me," Tony spluttered, drawing Steve from his musing. "Do I look like a dish towel?" "Yes." Peter giggled and brought his wet hands up to Tony's cheek and cackled as he rubbed them over, leaving a wet trail behind. "Oh, that is lovely," Tony mock glared. "Let's see how you like it." And then he cupped the back of Peter's head and brought his face close to Tony's, where he proceeded to rub his wet cheek against Peter's. "No!" Peter squealed, trying to get away, but he was laughing too hard. Steve smiled. He had definitely misjudged Tony, and made a vow to get to know the real Tony Stark and his family.